So I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow. Tomorrow is a very unusual day. It's the 10th of Tavas, and the 10th of Tavas is a fast day, but it's very, very unusual to ever have a fast day on Friday. Everyone knows, of course, that we never fast on Shabbos unless it's Yom Kippur, which is special. But even if the 9th of Av falls out on Shabbos, we then fast Saturday night and Sunday. But the same way we're not supposed to fast on Shabbos, because that takes away the joy of Shabbos, we're not supposed to fast on Friday, because we don't want to enter Shabbos in a state of deprivation or hunger. And yet, the only fast day that indeed we have even on Friday is the 10th of Tavas, tomorrow. Now, Baruch Hashem, it's a short fast because Shabbos is relatively early and the fast begins in the morning at dawn, so you could eat tonight and you'll be able to eat by, 4:30 or whatever the exact end of the fast is. But still, it's a very unusual feature. Now, there's another unusual feature about the 10th of Tavas, which is only because of the secular calendar. It's not relevant halachically. And that is, it is the only Jewish holiday or Jewish commemorative day that you can have two of them in the same secular year. Because sometimes, let's take like this year. This year, the 10th of Tavas is January 9th, what day is it, 29th? So next year, it'll be the end of December. So 2025, we'll have two Asara b'Tavases, and there's no other Jewish holiday that in a secular calendar year you'll have two of, right? Rosh Hashanah will never be in the same year, but the 10th of Tavas, you can get one in January and one in December. So you actually have 2025 will have two Asara b'Tavases. But okay, that's not of any halachic significance in and of itself. But what does Asara b'Tavas commemorate? So here you have to have a little bit of history. There are 4 fast days in the Jewish calendar that are connected to activities surrounding the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And in chronological order, they are the 10th of Tavas, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av, and the Psalm of Gedaliah. That's the sequence. So let's go over exactly what happened on each day. The 10th of Tavas is recorded in the book of Yirmiyahu as the day that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, began a siege against Jerusalem. So this was the very beginning of a process that 3 years later resulted in destruction of the temple. So in a sense, the 10th of Tavas is the beginning of everything, but nothing in particular bad happened that day, meaning nothing was destroyed, nothing was broken into, nothing was conquered. It was the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. Now note as well that this event is only for the first temple, meaning there's nothing in the 10th of Tavas that's connected to the second temple. It's only happened the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, 17th of Tammuz, a little more complicated. 17th of Tammuz was the day that the Romans, at the time of the second temple, broke into Jerusalem after their siege, culminating in the destruction of the temple 3 weeks later. So you already have a little bit of a logical disconnect because the 10th of Tavas is connected to the first temple. The breaking into the city of 17th of Tammuz is connected to the second temple. So Chazal explain that in reality, the date that the Babylonians broke into the wall of the first temple, of the city in the time of the first temple, was the 9th of Tammuz. So 9th of Tammuz was the breaking into the city of the Bayis Rishon. 17th of Tammuz was the breaking into the city of the Bayit Sheni. So logically, we ought to have 2 fast days. One is a fast day of the 9th of Tammuz, and one is a fast day of the 17th of Tammuz. But the sages did not want to create 2 fast days in so close proximity. Although Lamaisa, we do it with some Gedaliah and Yom Kippur, but we normally don't want to do that. So they decided to commemorate the second temple. But when we have the 17th of Tammuz, we are still thinking about the breaking into the city of the first, which was a few days earlier. Okay, so in a sense, therefore, Asara b'Tavas is only the Mikdash Rishon. Shivas or B'Tammuz is Mikdash Sheni, but we also incorporate the Hufka Ha'ir, the city being broken through in the first temple of the 9th of Tammuz. The 9th of Av, of course, is the common denominator. That was the day of both the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash. The first Beis HaMikdash on the part of the Babylonians, the second Beis HaMikdash on the Romans. And how many years are there between the Chorban of the first temple and the building of the second temple? There are 490 years. Because the first temple was destroyed and there were 70 years of the Babylonian exile, which includes Achashverosh, includes Persia and the like. And the second temple began to be rebuilt in the second year of, again, let me just give you a few names here. Babylonia was conquered by Persia, and the Persian kings were Cyrus, Koresh, Achashverosh, and Achashverosh's son from Esther, who actually was Jewish, Darius II. And the second temple was built under the reign of Darius II. They began building it in the second year of his reign, and it was dedicated in the 6th year of his reign. It took 4 years of construction. But when we count when the second temple is built, we're actually counting from its beginning, the second year of Darius, not the completion. So therefore, from the destruction of the temple to the second year of Darius is 70 years. And the second temple stood 420 years. And then it was destroyed. So what does that mean? From the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash until the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, on the exact day of the 9th of Av, is 490 years. Okay, everyone understands that? And this was actually prophesied way, way ahead of time in the book of Daniel, the book of Daniel, where Hashem told Daniel, there are 70 weeks that have been declared on the city of Yerushalayim, and a week in that context means a group of 7 years. So 70 weeks of years. So 70 times 7 is 490. So the idea that from the Chorban Bayis Rishon to the Chorban Bayis Sheni would be 490 years is already recorded in Tanakh, shortly after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Okay. Be it as it may, therefore, just getting you the pattern here. So the 10th of Tavas is primarily concerned with the first temple. Shivasar B'Tammuz is primarily concerned with the second temple, except for the fact that on the 9th of Tammuz, the city was broken into. Tisha B'Av is, of course, the day of Churban, both for the first Mikdash and the second Mikdash. And then the last of the fast day cycle for the Beis HaMikdash is the fast of Gedaliah. Now, who is Gedaliah? So again, this is in the book of Yirmiyahu. And that is that when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash, and most of the Jews were exiled from the land, a small group of people, small group of Jews, were allowed to stay in Eretz Yisrael, primarily to farm fields and produce vineyards, so there would be taxation paid to the king. And the king, Nebuchadnezzar, appointed a governor over the Jewish people, a Jewish governor, whose name was Gedaliah ben Achikam, who was a very big tzaddik, a righteous person. And as long as Gedaliah was there, the Jewish people felt there was some settlement in Eretz Yisrael, and maybe there was hope for a quick redemption. Gedaliah ben Achikam was assassinated shortly after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and that kind of ended the Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael until the return years later, and that became kind of the final nail in the coffin over the Churban Beis HaMikdash. According to our Messiah, Gedaliah was actually killed on Rosh Hashanah. He was killed on Rosh Hashanah, but since you're not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah, so we defer the fast to the first permissible day where you could fast, which is the 3rd of Tishrei. Right? 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is Aleph Tishrei, Beis Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, Som Gedaliah is the 3rd of Tishrei. So again, it's interesting, you kind of have bookends here, because here's the thing. Asara BTeves is only commemorating a tragedy of the first Mikdash. Gedaliah is also only commemorating a tragedy of the first Mikdash. There is no event, as far as I know, on the 3rd of Tishrei that is connected to the second Beis HaMikdash. Shivas Arba Tammuz kind of commemorates both, and Tisha B'Av for sure commemorates both. Okay, so that's a little bit to consider. Now, there is a very fascinating chiddush of Rav David Avudraham. I don't know if anyone here is Sephardi who has the name Avudraham. Avudraham is actually a name that is a relatively common name among Sephardim, but the Avudraham, as he's called, was a very, very early Acharon, or maybe a late Rishon, who wrote one of the most definitive svarim on Jewish liturgy, on tefillah, on the calendar, and the like. And the Beis Yosef quotes the Avudraham very, very, very often. And the Avudraham says a very interesting chiddush. He says, Asara BTeves is already unique that we fast on Erev Shabbos. But says the Avudraham, if it would be possible for the 10th of Teves to fall out on Shabbos, we would even fast on Shabbos. Now, this is an untestable hypothetical, because based on the Jewish calendar, it is impossible for the 10th of Teves to ever fall out on Shabbos. So we can't prove the Avudraham right, and we can't prove him wrong, because it'll never happen. But he says, theoretically, if it would happen, you would even fast on Shabbos.
Like Yom Kippur, right?
Like Yom Kippur. Now the question is, why should that be so? Because let's think about this. If we ask the question, which is a more chamor fast? Asara BTeves or Tisha B'Av? There is no question. Tisha B'Av is much, much more chamor. Number one, it's a 24-hour fast. Number two, not only don't you eat or drink, but like Yom Kippur, right? You don't wear shoes, etc. And number three, it's the actual day of the Chorban. So, for example, for Asara BTeves, again, I'm not giving you a psak, if you ask a shayla, if you have a pretty bad headache, we would be pretty lenient in saying, okay, you can drink some water. On the 9th of Av, it's got to be much worse. So, here's the thing. The 9th of Av is a much more chomer fast than Asara BTeves. And yet, if the 9th of Av falls out on Shabbos, we don't fast. We push it off to the next day. Right? If the 9th of Av is on a Shabbos, we don't observe Tisha B'Av till Saturday night and Sunday. So if even the 9th of Av, Yom Kippur is the only exception, if even the 9th of Av, we don't fast on Shabbos, then why would I fast if the 10th of Teves falls out on Shabbos? The 10th of Teves is less chamor than the 9th of Av. Right? It's a good question. Why would it have that special chashivas? So there's a very powerful vort from the Chassam Sofer on this. And he says the following, even though we commonly say that the only fast we do on Shabbos is Yom Kippur, but there's one other fast we can do on Shabbos as well. And that's a fast for a bad dream. There is a halacha called Tainis Chalom. But this really maybe should have a shir on its own, meaning what is Judaism's view about dreams? Well, obviously, if you read the last few parshios, dreams are really, really a big thing in Yosef's life. Yosef dreams that he's going to be a king. And then Yosef interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker, and that gets him out of prison. And then Yosef interprets the dreams of Paro, and that's how Yosef becomes the Mishnah Lamelech. Right? We have three, of course, earlier than that, Yaakov had dreams where God appears to him. So the notion of, particularly in Chumash Bereshis, maybe more so than the other Chumashim, the notion of dreams as being revelations, as being prophecies, as being messages from God, are very clearly part of the narrative here. So what does that mean if I have a dream? Is God giving me messages or what? So the Gemara says the following idea. Just as it is impossible for there to be grain without chaff, grain without straw, so too in every dream there may be kernels of prophecy and truth surrounded by a bunch of static and junk. So Chazal understood that a lot of the dreams we have are just meaningless. They don't mean a lot. But there may be a kernel of truth in the dream that's prophetic. You don't know. Meaning the more righteous you are, the less junk there'll be in your dreams. So great tzaddikim, their dreams are direct messages from God. For most of us, our dreams are filled with shtusim, but in the middle of the shtusim, there may be a message. So because of this, there is actually a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that let's say a person has a frightening dream. God forbid a person dreamt of death, destruction, something really, really bad. Now, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's nothing. We're not saying it means anything. Maybe it's you saw a horror movie or whatever it would be. So it doesn't mean anything. But maybe it does mean something. And particularly if it's repeated, it comes back to you. So one of the ways you avert the evil decree that might be in a dream is by fasting. You fast that God should accept your fast as an atonement and cancel the dream. So this is such an important thing. I'll talk about what we do today, but this is such an important thing that let's say you had a very bad dream Friday night. You are allowed to fast for a bad dream even on Shabbos. Amazing.
Do you have to?
Well, you don't have to anyway. I mean, it's not a chiyuv, but you're permitted. And people who knew the Chavetz Chaim recorded. The Chavetz Chaim had many dreams, and of course, the Chavetz Chaim's dreams were often prophetic. And people would say often he didn't eat on Shabbos. He was fasting a tainis chalom. Now, here's the funny thing about it. If you do fast a tainis chalom b'Shabbos, which you're allowed to do, you have to make another fast during the week to get atonement for fasting on Shabbos. So this is a real strange thing. You're allowed to fast on Shabbos, but you need a kapara for fasting on Shabbos. So you have to fast during the week. Be sure not to make that second fast on Shabbos, because then you'll need a third one, right? But fast during the week. Okay.
What does the fast have to be?
Huh? No. So the fast is a daytime fast. It's from morning to night, just like Asara BTeves. Now, there's another thing we do for dreams, which in Eretz Yisrael we don't do so much, and might be a little curious. If you remember the old world, right, the old home, so to speak, in Chutz La'aretz for Ashkenazim, not Sephardim, for Ashkenazim, we only recite Birkas Kohanim. We only recite the Kohanim Duchen only on the Musaf of Yom Tov. They don't do it on Shabbos. They don't do it during the week. Now, if you remember, in the Musaf of Yom Tov, I mean, it's in the Article Siddur. So when the Kohanim finish the pasuk, V'recha Hashem v'yishmerecha, so before they say v'yishmerecha, they're singing along. So there's a paragraph that we're supposed to say in between the verses called Ribono Shel Olam, asking Hashem that all of the dreams that we had that may be negative dreams, Hashem should turn them into positive. And this is already from the Gemara. The Gemara says at the time when the Kohanim are singing between the verses, one asks Hashem to be meitiv the Chalom. Now, you'll notice, of course, here in Eretz Yisrael, or at least Yerushalayim, when we duchen every day, we don't stop for the Ribono Shel Olam, right? So you don't really have a chance to do it. But you may also notice, not everybody follows this, but you may notice that on Yomim Tovim, in the Musaf, they do sing in between. So in other words, you get the same chances as you would get in Chutz La'aretz, meaning to say, you don't get extra chances to say the Ribono Shel Olam, but at least on the Yom Tov, we'll give you the chance. The reason why, because when you duchen every day, so we don't assume necessarily that people had bad dreams, every day, but by Yom Tov, you've accumulated, somebody has accumulated some bad dreams, so we do defer it for the Yom Tov. Okay, Now, there's a third thing people do, and that is some Siddurim have this. This is called Hatavat Chalom, making a dream good. You have a basin of 3, like a Torah's Nedarim, and you declare that you had a bad dream, and they release you from the negativity of the dream, and you couple it with tzedakah. Now, if you were to ask me today, should you fast if you have a bad dream? Should you fast? So the truth of the matter is, we largely discourage extra fasting today, because for many people, this type of fasting will affect a person's kavanah for davening, a person's learning, and the like. So we don't encourage extra fasting. We'll say give tzedakah, say the Hatavas Chalom, and maybe even have a Tainus Dibur. Tainus Dibur is an interesting type of fast. That's where you fast in not talking, meaning you don't talk for a day. And they say a Tainus Dibur is even greater than a Tainus of food, right? It might even be harder in some ways. Okay, now, let's go back to the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer ponders, and you'll see how this will connect to Asara BTeves. I mean, right, the Chasam Sofer is going to use Tainus Chalom to explain Asara BTeves. If you're not allowed to fast on Shabbos, then why would you be allowed to have a dream fast, a Tainus Chalom on Shabbos? So the Chasam Sofer says, Tainus Chalom is very different than other fast days. Normal fasts are commemorating tragedies of the past. The 9th of Av, the 17th of Tammuz, Gedaliah. You're mourning, you're grieving, you're experiencing sad moments. So on Shabbos, we don't want you to grieve, we don't want you to mourn, so you don't fast over the tragedies of the past. A Tainus Chalom is future-oriented, not past-oriented. A Tainus Chalom is praying that God should not bring an evil decree upon me. So the Chasam Sofer says, a fast that is not focused on the sad events of the past, but is focused on averting a future calamity, that, he says, you are allowed to fast even on Shabbos. Right? That's Tainus Chalom. So now, says the Chasam Sofer the following. The reason why the Avudraham would permit you to fast on the 10th of Teves is because it will actually be analogous to a dream fast. Now the question is, well, wait a second. That doesn't seem right. Just like Tisha B'Av is about a tragedy of the past, the 10th of Teves is about a tragedy of the past, the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. It's not like a dream fast. So here's where the Chasam Sofer adds a special nekudah, a special point that makes this day so extremely important. You know, every Rosh Hashanah is called a Yom Hadin, a day of judgment. Why is it called Yom Hadin? Because Hashem decides on Rosh Hashanah who will live and who will die. It's not the final judgment. The final judgment is Yom Kippur, right? The way we describe it is, on Rosh Hashanah, God inscribes in the book. On Yom Kippur, God signs the book. Hoshana Rabbah, he delivers it to the angels to carry out. And in truth, some even say Hanukkah. That God can call back the angels until Hanukkah. So God gives us a lot of extensions, right? It's kind of like a teacher keeping on giving you extensions on your term paper or whatever it is. But nevertheless, the beginning of the Yom Hadin is Rosh Hashanah. So says the Chasam Sofer, the same way there's a Yom Hadin on each individual, who will live and who will die. There's a Yom Hadin when Hashem decides if the Beis HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt this year. The 10th of Teves is the Rosh Hashanah for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Meaning, tomorrow, Hashem is going to decide if we will be Zocha to a Beis HaMikdash in 5785, or Chas v'Shalom, we will not be Zocha to the Beis HaMikdash in 5785. Therefore, it's like a Tainus Chalom because we're fasting not just to commemorate a tragedy of the past. We're fasting to prevent the tragedy in the future of the temple not being rebuilt. Just like you can have a tainis chalom, so a bad thing shouldn't happen. So we can fast Asara BTeves even on Shabbos, so a bad thing shouldn't happen, i.e., that the Beis HaMikdash should be rebuilt instead of remaining destroyed. Right? That's the Chazam Sofer's rationale. Which means, tomorrow is a very momentous day. Tomorrow, it will be determined in Shemayim if the Beis HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt this year or not. Now, let's just flesh that out a little bit. If, God willing, we get a favorable judgment that the Beis HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt this year, Baruch Hashem, that's great. But let's say, God forbid, there's a negative judgment, that God decrees the temple will not be rebuilt this year. So let me ask you, on the 11th of Teves, the 12th of Teves, the 9th of Av coming up, is there any point in praying for the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash if it was already decreed on the 10th of Teves we're not going to get it this year? The answer is yes, because again, let's look at the analogy of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur itself. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, whatever the final day was, it was decided if you're going to live or die. So you might take the position, what's the use of my davening after Yom Kippur? If I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and if I'm not going to die, I was given life. The short answer is that Hashem's rachamim is such that even when a final decree was made, meaning even if it was decreed the person will die in Rosh Hashanah, you can pray through tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah to rip up the evil decree. There is really no such thing as absolute finality. The only thing is, it's harder to rip up a decree that was already made than to prevent that decree in the first place. So I would rather get a favorable judgment on Rosh Hashanah than get a negative judgment and then try to change it. Because it's harder to change it than to get a good one to begin with. So don't give up hope, but it does mean that every single day you can ask for the Beis HaMikdash. Never have the attitude, oy vey, if it was paskin the Asara BTeves, my prayers are for naught. That's vaday not the case. But nevertheless, it is the Yom Hadin, so it's a very opportune time to be mispalel for the binyan Beis HaMikdash. This is a very interesting chiddush of the Chasam Sofer, that the 10th of Teves is the day of the building of the Beis the day that Hashem decrees in Shemayim if there's going to be a Beis HaMikdash. But now I want to make another point about Asara BTeves. And that is, it's clear that all of the fast days connected to the temple are rooted in earlier sins that we did. That the root of those korbanos are the earlier averos in our history that created blemishes and negative forces. For example, the 17th of Tammuz, the day that the Romans broke into the city, happens to be the day that Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos. Remember, on Shavuos he went up to Har Sinai. He was there for 40 days. He comes down on the 40th day, and he sees the Jewish people worshiping the golden calf, and he smashes the Luchos. That happened on, if you count 40 days from 6th of Sivan, you'll get 17th of Tammuz. So the shorish, the root of the tragedies of the 17th of Tammuz, is the Chet HaEgel. Similarly, for the 9th of Av, the root of the tragedies of the 9th of Av is the sin of the spies, the Chet HaMeraglim. Remember, Moshe Rabbeinu sends 12 spies to check out the land. 10 of them come back with a very negative report that we're not going to win, the enemies are too strong, we're going to be destroyed. And only 2 spies, Yoshua and Kalef said that we have to have faith in God. And it mentions that night, the spies came back the 8th of Av. That night, the 9th of Av, all the people cried and sobbed and wept. And Hashem decreed, you are crying for no reason. I will make this day a day of eternal mourning. So if the 17th of Tammuz is based on the ego, and Tisha B'Av is based on the Chet of the Meraglim, Tzom Gedaliah might even be connected to something deeper. I had mentioned that Gedaliah was killed on Rosh Hashanah, even though we don't observe the fast till after Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, of course, is the day that Adam and Chava were created. That's the 6th day of creation. Hashem began creating the world the 25th of Elul, but Rosh Hashanah, when we say it's the birthday of the world, we actually mean it's the birthday of Adam. Well, on one hand, it's a birthday, but you know, a very bad thing happened on Adam HaRishon's first day on earth. The Chet of the Eitz Hadas. Right, it was a busy Friday. They were created. Eitz Hadas, they were expelled. Cain and Hevel were born. I mean, everything happened that day. So, what do you see about 3 of the 4 fasts? Again, 17th of Tammuz connected to Ego. 9th of Av connected to Meraglim. Tzom Gedaliah connected to the Chet of Adam HaRishon. So what is the 10th of Tavas connected to? What earlier sin can we connect the fast of the 10th of Tavas? So we don't have a clear makar in Chazal, but Rav Shlomo Fisher, Zichrono Livracha, was a tremendous, I don't know if you've heard of him, tremendous gain, not only in Shas and Poskim, but in Kabbalah, in philosophy, in science, like he knew all the Chachmas. He brings from different sources that the 10th of Tavas was the day that Yosef was sold by his brothers into slavery. Now again, if you ask me, does the Gemara say that? No. Does the Medrash say that? No. But there are sources that say that. So we now have a very interesting hierarchy. Asara b'Tavas, Mechiras Yosef. Shiva Asar b'Tammuz, Chet Ego. Tisha B'Av, Chet HaMeraglim. Tzom Gedaliah, the Chet of Adam HaRishon. Now, if that's the case, and we look at the devastating tragedy of Mechiras Yosef, that essentially Mechiras Yosef, just as Mechiras Yosef set into motion the factors that made us slaves in Mitzrayim, Mechiras Yosef set into motion Asara b'Tavas, which in turn set into motion what would culminate in the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, the beginning of the siege against Yerushalayim. So, since it's incumbent upon us, particularly on the day that God is deciding if we'll be Zocha to a Beis HaMikdash, we need to rectify the Aveira of Mechiras Yosef. Now, obviously we can't rectify the actual sale of Yosef. That was done, and we can't change that Maisa, but we rectify the attitudes. The attitudes were hatred, jealousy, envy, brothers fighting with brothers. Sinas China, which Chazal say anyway, in an unrelated statement, was the cause for the Chorban Bayis Sheni, which is the temple we're missing now. But even Asara b'Tavas already, you see the message of having to be Mesakein, Sinas China. You know, I've made this point many times, so forgive me for repeating it again. But this is especially important now. If you remember what Israeli society was like before October 7th of 2023, the country was actually being torn apart by a debate about judicial reform. It almost sounds silly that this was such an issue, but this was very serious. Businesses were talking about pulling out of the country. There were soldiers and people in Miluim, people in reserves, who were saying they were not going to report to service. Now, Baruch Hashem, when October 7 happened, everybody reported. But who knows if Hamas was not emboldened? If Hamas is getting the message that a lot of soldiers aren't going to show up, they might have made a decision that this is a good time to attack. And some have suggested that. And the hatred and the polarization was massive. People literally were talking about civil war. They were talking about a disintegration of the end of Israel. Not because of the war, because of the machlokas within our own people. So then came the great tragedy of October 7. Over 1,000 people were killed, 200 hostages were taken, and a war that's still going on much, much longer than we thought it would be. There are still, many hostages have tragically died, and there are still people in captivity, although Trump is making statements that if they don't get released by, all hell is going to break loose, whatever that means exactly. Of course, that'll be when he annexes Canada and Greenland and everything else. And what's the other thing? He has 4 things he wants to do. He wants to take over Greenland, make Canada the 51st state, reclaim the Panama Canal, and then there's a little thing. He wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico to be the Gulf of America. He has 4 things he wants to do. But be as it may, we're still in a very tragic situation. But if there's any silver cloud in tragedy, it did bring us together with achdus and unity and care. And people stopped caring if you're wearing a velvet yarmulke or a knitted yarmulke or not wearing a kippah at all. And in the middle of a very sad situation, it was very heartwarming to see the love and the care and the achdus that existed. And maybe these tragedies are Hashem's way of bringing us together. But then what happens is, as the war goes on and on and on and on, we're like an elastic band, right? You stretch an elastic, a rubber band, and you let go, it just goes back to where it was. So unfortunately, we are reverting back a little bit to the bad habits of sinas chinam and polarization. And that's a tragedy on top of a tragedy, because if you have a tragedy and you grow from it and you learn from it, so it was a tragedy, but you've gained from it, you've grown. If you have a tragedy and you don't grow from it, that itself becomes a secondary tragedy. The tragedy of going through such a difficult experience and not being transformed. So we got to be careful about that. We have to be careful. Again, there are so many issues that do divide us. Issues of army and charedim in the army, and yeshiva in the army, and judicial reform actually is coming back again as an issue because that was never resolved. How that turned into an attack on religious Jews, I don't know. Somehow judicial reform is a controversy, but somehow it's been morphed into an attack on the Haredi world. That's a bit of a jump there, but okay, but be it as it may. So there are many issues that divide us. These are issues. You have both pieces?
Yeah.
Oh, great, okay. So I'll just leave this here for this. Yeah. There are many issues that divide us, but these are issues we can discuss, we can debate. Nobody's saying, don't debate, don't discuss, don't argue. Every page of Gemara. Right? If Jews were to say don't argue, we wouldn't have a Talmud. So of course we argue. But we can still argue with loving each other, caring about each other, respecting each other. And that's a tikkun of Mechiras Yosef. And only when we are misakein the chet of Mechiras Yosef, which was the cause of the fast of Asara BTeves, can we then be zocha to the binyan Beis Hamikdash. So B'ezras Hashem, may all of us tomorrow be zocha, just as we say on Rosh Hashanah, kesiva v'chasima tova, a good writing and a good sealing, So for Binyan Beis HaMikdash, may we be zocha as well to a kesiva v'chasima tova.
Thank you for listening to this SOMAYACHS production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.